The First Amendment of the Constitution lists 5 freedoms guaranteed to the people of the United States. One of these freedoms is the freedom of press. Freedom of press is the right for people to write and print without censorship of the government. The amendment was created in order for the people to freely distribute information and opinions without the threat of government involvement or fear of punishment. This right does not protect subjects including obscenity or sedition. Freedom of the press includes forms of information distribution such as newspapers, radios, and television. This allows for a mass spread of information that can travel through a local community, city, state, nation, or throughout the entire world.
One landmark Supreme Court decision that deals with the freedom of the press is the New York Times versus United States. Within the case, Daniel Ellsberg, a senior research associate at MIT Center for International Studies, turned over the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times in 1968 without authorization. The papers detailed the U.S.'s involvement in Indochina during World War II and were classified as top secret by the federal government. The New York Times started to publish articles based on the leaked papers. After the third daily installment, the Department of Justice obtained a restraining order suspending the publication of the materials. The DOJ argued that the publication of the materials would present immediate and irreparable harm to U.S. national defense interests. When taken to the Supreme Court, the justices in a 6-3 decision held that the materials could continue to be published since the federal government failed to prove that the materials threatened national security interests. The court case provides the standard for the relationship between government regulation and freedom of the press. The Supreme Court decided that the media may publish any materials that do not pose an immediate threat to national security to the people of the United States. Another landmark court case on the freedom of the press includes Hazelwood v. Kohlmeyer. This court case covers freedom of the press when it comes to school newspapers. The principal at Hazelwood East High School ordered that 2 articles within the school newspaper be removed when he deemed the articles to be inappropriate. Kathy Kohlmeyer, a student working on the newspaper, brought the issue to court on the basis that the principal violated the student's freedom of the press. However, in a 5-3 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that the school had the right to set high standards for the newspaper, and it did not violate the freedom of the press for the school to exercise editorial control over the newspaper. This case established the power that schools have over students' freedom of the press, as it is much more restricted in schools than in the general public. The school need not tolerate student speech that it deems to be inappropriate or inconsistent with the mission statement of the school.
When exploring the freedom of the press within the school community, students have the freedom to create, produce, and distribute a school newspaper in order to inform the students of events happening within their school community. In order to explore the freedoms and restrictions placed on the student newspaper, an interview was conducted on Mr. Jackson, the advisor of the Hough student newspaper, along with some of the student writers. The Hough student newspaper is formatted online and is run by the students for the students. When asked why the student newspaper is important, Avery Wagers stated,
It gives people different perspectives because real newspapers is just like adults writing about it, but we kind of get to write from a different perspective that some people might not know about.
When speaking of the topics the Hough student newspaper usually publishes, Mr. Jackson stated,
anything that is, quote, of interest to the student body of Hough High School. So it's usually stuff that's happening either to or by or of or around students. But it can be things that are happening nationally that simply students are interested in. So really it's pretty much anything that is of interest to our students.
When speaking of the restrictions placed on the student newspaper, Blair Gardner says,
Stuff that are way too political, stuff that, if a teacher can't really talk about it, then we're not supposed to talk about it either.
While the Hough Press must follow professional guidelines, they also must abide by the school and district policy. These policies are primarily enforced by the school's principal, Dr. Rosenbach. Any student-generated press representing Hough High is supposed to be run through her before being released. Throughout her years as principal, Rosenbach doesn't recall rejecting stories developed by Hough's student news staff, as the material produced typically falls under her and CMS's guidelines. Dr. Rosenbach's primary concern with the press comes from students' independent social media. Rosenbach deals frequently with conflicts that arise from social media accounts and says it's exhausting to keep track of. Having immediate access to social media can cause students to make impulsive decisions that can humiliate themselves and others. Rosenbach stressed that it's important for students to realize that once something's on the internet, it's there forever. With social media, Hough can't monitor or control what is sent out, but still has to deal with the effects. This makes social media a difficult task for schools to tackle and can do just as much harm as good. Overall, Hough thinks it's important for students to have a voice and right to the press. However, there are guidelines set by CMS that must be followed, limiting total freedom of press. As students have the ability to be a part of the press these days, it's important to be responsible and report wisely.